They knew exactly what they were doing when they pointed the finger at you. It wasn't confusion. It wasn't a mistake. It was a strategy, cold, calculated, and cruel, because the truth they buried would have shattered the image they wore like armor. So they handed you the burden of their sins, made you wear the guilt like a second skin, and the world believed them because they cried louder, lied smoother, played victim better, but deep down in the quiet corners of their conscience, they knew. They always knew you were not the villain. You were the evidence, and that's why they needed you silent. That's why they blamed you for what they did. Projection, the coward's mirror. They couldn't bear to face what lived inside them, so they used you as the canvas to project it onto. Every wound they refused to heal, every lie they couldn't outrun, they stitched it to your name instead, because to confront their own reflection would mean they'd have to admit it, that they were the one who betrayed, who manipulated, who destroyed something beautiful with their own hands. But they were too weak for that kind of truth, so they turned the mirror around and blamed you. It wasn't about what you did wrong. It was about what they didn't want to acknowledge in themselves. They gave you their guilt like a gift wrapped in false concern. Look what you've done, they'd whisper, even though they were the architect of the very ruin they accused you of causing. You were simply the nearest exit from their shame. You became their alibi, the reason they didn't have to grow, the excuse they needed to remain unchanged. And the tragedy is, you believed them for a while. You questioned your own intentions, your memory, your kindness. You tried to fix what they broke, apologize for what they did, and carry the weight of choices that were never yours. But no matter how much of their blame you wore, it never lightened their soul, because projection doesn't heal. It only hides. And while they kept hiding behind a mask of false innocence, you stood there accused, abandoned, misunderstood. Not because you failed, but because you reflected too much truth. You reminded them of what they didn't want to see. Your honesty made their lies obvious. Your strength made their cowardice visible. And in their eyes, that was unforgivable. So they punished you not for your flaws, but for their own, the ones they tried to drown in silence, in blame, in your character. And that's the cruelest part of all. They didn't just blame you. They made you question if you were truly the problem. But now you know, you were never the problem. You were the proof, the mirror they couldn't bear to face. And when people can't face their own shadows, they attack the light that exposes them. So let them point, let them whisper, let them create their fiction. Because truth has no expiry date, and one day, what they threw at you will return to them not out of revenge, but out of justice. You see, when a person blames the innocent, they're not escaping responsibility, they're just postponing it. And the reckoning always comes, not in your hands, but in the silence where truth waits, watching, remembering, and returning. Control through confusion. They didn't want you to understand, they wanted you to doubt. To second, guess your thoughts, your memories, even your instincts. Because confusion, when crafted carefully, becomes a cage, not with bars of steel, but with shadows shifting, uncertain, paralyzing. And they were masters of this quiet manipulation. They'd change their story by the hour, twist conversations into knots, deny what was said just yesterday. Not because they forgot, but because they wanted you to forget what was real, what was right, what was true. It was never about finding clarity. It was about keeping you dizzy, emotionally disoriented, grasping at logic that kept moving just beyond your reach. You started to question yourself, not because you were unstable, but because they destabilized the ground beneath you slowly, strategically. And while you were lost in your own confusion, they stood calm in control, watching you unravel and wondering when you'd finally break. They smiled in moments you should have cried, turned apologies into arguments, and made silence feel like punishment. Because when you're unsure of your own mind, you're easier to control, easier to tame, and that's what they wanted, not love, not partnership, not honesty, control, wrapped in the illusion of closeness. They created problems and then blamed you for the mess. They'd say, you're too sensitive. When you noticed the cracks, you're overthinking. When you caught the lie, you're imagining things. When your gut screamed the truth. Every sentence designed to erode your certainty, your voice, your confidence. Until one day, you stopped trusting yourself altogether, and that's when they felt powerful. Not because they were strong, but because they had successfully made you small. But the truth is, they feared your clarity. They feared what would happen the moment you stopped spinning in circles and started walking in a straight line. Because if you ever saw things as they truly were, their entire illusion would collapse. And that's exactly what they couldn't afford. So they played this cruel game not to win your heart, but to possess your mind. But confusion is a fragile cage. It only works as long as you stay inside it. And one moment of stillness, one breath of clarity, one brave question that refuses to be silenced, that's all it takes for the whole thing to crack. Because deep inside you, there's a voice they couldn't extinguish, a knowing they couldn't destroy, and that voice is rising now, slowly, steadily. You're remembering what's real, and they can feel it, the shift, the unraveling of their control, and the worst part for them. Once you see the game, it no longer works. Once you name the cage, the door appears, and once you walk out, they lose everything they built on your confusion. Playing the victim to stay in power, they hurt you, and then they wore your wounds like they were their own. They twisted the story until they stood at the center, not as the one who caused the pain, but as the one who supposedly endured it. That was the performance, quiet enough to seem humble, loud enough to earn sympathy. They didn't want accountability, they wanted applause. So they rewrote the script, cast themselves as the broken-hearted, the misunderstood, the one who tried so hard. And you were rewritten as the villain, the aggressor, the cold one, the one who never appreciated their efforts. But none of it was true, they knew it, and somewhere deep down so did you. But lies, when repeated enough, become convincing, especially when told with tears, with trembling hands, with well-timed silence. They didn't just lie to others, they lied to themselves. Because pretending to be the victim meant they never had to apologize, never had to confront what they did in the dark, never had to clean up the emotional wreckage they left behind. Playing weak was their strength. Acting wounded was their defense. And they mastered the art of sympathy, not to heal, but to shield themselves from judgment. It wasn't just about avoiding blame, it was about controlling the narrative, making sure that if anyone ever asked what happened, the answer would be tilted, slanted, poisoned, and the worst part, most people believed them. Because we live in a world where the loudest pain is heard first, not the truest one. But here's what they didn't expect. They didn't expect your silence to grow into wisdom. They didn't expect the truth to keep breathing long after the lies were spoken. And they didn't expect you to rise quietly, powerfully, without needing to prove anything to anyone, because you no longer need to scream the truth for it to be real. Their victim act might win them temporary protection, maybe even pity, but the truth, it has a longer lifespan than sympathy. And one day the very people they convinced will start to notice the cracks, the inconsistencies, the way their story shifts under pressure. Because eventually all masks get heavy, and when they slip, the real face is revealed not to you, because you already saw it, but to the world they tried to fool. And when that day comes, they will not just lose control. They will lose the very power they stole, because pretending to be the victim might buy them time, but it can't buy them truth. And truth always arrives, not when it's convenient, but when it's undeniable. You triggered what they buried. You walked in with sincerity, unaware that your presence alone would shake something in them they spent years trying to bury. You didn't cause their chaos, you reminded them of it. Your honesty touched the nerves they numbed. Your strength echoed through the hollow places they tried to forget. You triggered not their anger but their shame, and shame has a strange way of defending itself. It doesn't confess, it attacks, it distracts, it turns the spotlight on you, because if they could make you the problem, they wouldn't have to face what was stirring beneath their surface. You see, they built their life around avoidance, around a carefully crafted image, polished, practiced, untouchable. But then you came along with truth, with presence, with something real, and suddenly their mask felt too tight, their silence too loud. You weren't loud, you were clear, and clarity is dangerous to those who have made comfort out of denial. That's why they turned cold. That's why they lashed out. That's why, without warning, the person who once smiled at you now looked at you like you were the threat. Because you saw something. Maybe you didn't say it. Maybe you didn't even fully know it. But they felt it, that unspoken recognition. And to them, that was exposure. So they buried their discomfort under blame. And they told the world it was you who changed, you who stirred drama, you who crossed the line. But what really happened was simpler. You saw through them, you saw past the charm, past the performance, into the parts they hadn't even admitted to themselves. And some people would rather destroy the mirror than face what it reflects. You were never the villain, you were the reflection, the uncomfortable truth standing calmly in the room, the reminder of what they weren't ready to heal. And so, they tried to silence the trigger you instead of confronting the trauma. But you must understand this. Their reaction was never about your worth. It was about their wounds. Wounds you didn't cause, but you accidentally revealed. You were just being you, and that, in itself, became too much for someone who spent their life hiding. So let them retreat. Let them rewrite. Let them convince others that your presence was the problem. Because those who are committed to healing will see the difference between a wound being exposed and a weapon being used. And one day, perhaps quietly, they will remember you, not as the enemy, but as the turning point they once tried to erase. And whether they face it or not is no longer your burden. You didn't come to destroy them, you came to shine. But some shadows scream when the light enters. That's not your fault. That's just a sign that you were never small, you were always undeniably seen. They knew you'd stay quiet, they didn't choose you because you were weak. They chose you because you were good, because you cared more about peace than proving a point, because you valued loyalty over victory, and they knew it, they studied it, and then they used it. They knew you'd stay quiet when it hurt, knew you'd rather carry the weight alone than cause a scene, knew you'd defend their name even while they whispered lies about yours. That wasn't love, that was strategy, because silence like yours, it becomes a shield not for you, but for them. They knew you wouldn't scream when it was unfair, that you'd question yourself before you ever questioned them. That's what made you the perfect target, not because you were blind, but because you were kind. You gave chances they didn't deserve. You gave explanations they never earned. You kept their secrets, protected their reputation, while they slowly rewrote yours. And the saddest part, they mistook your silence for ignorance. They thought you didn't see, but you did. You saw the shifts in tone, the coldness behind the smiles, the way truth disappeared every time you got too close to it. But still, you stayed quiet, not because you didn't notice, but because you hoped. Hoped they'd change, hoped they'd come clean, hoped that loyalty might be enough to wake them up. But they didn't wake. They took. They took your grace as permission, your silence as surrender, and they kept taking until there was barely anything left of you in the mirror. But here's what they never expected. Silence doesn't mean forever. Stillness isn't the same as weakness. Sometimes silence is survival, a way to observe without reacting, a way to outlast the storm without losing your soul in it. And when the time came, you didn't raise your voice, you raised your worth. You didn't destroy them, you distanced yourself. And in that distance, something beautiful happened. You remembered who you were before they needed you quiet. You found your voice not to fight them, but to free yourself. And as you grew louder in your purpose, in your peace, in your truth, their power shrank. Because the only thing keeping their story alive was your silence. And now that silence is gone, not replaced by rage, but by clarity, by strength, by truth that stands without apology, and the irony, now they want to be heard, now they want to explain, now they want you to forget what they once hoped you'd never find the courage to say. But it's too late, because you finally spoke, not in anger, not in vengeance, but in truth, And once truth speaks, everything false begins to fall apart.